Open the freezer door and stand there for 10 seconds. That's already enough to make you want to close it. Now imagine that cold is just the air outside, all day, every day, for thousands of years in a row. That's not an exaggeration. That's an actual period of human history. And people didn't just survive it. They raised kids in it. At its coldest point, the planet ran something like 6 degrees colder than it does now, on average. Doesn't sound like much until you remember that's a global average, dragging down summer and winter alike. Ice sheets buried a huge share of the land. Sea levels dropped so far that stretches of ocean floor turned into walkable ground. No heated buildings, no insulated jackets from a store, no trucks bringing food in from somewhere warmer, just people, animals, ice, and whatever they could build with their own hands. And this wasn't a rough week, or even a rough decade. The coldest stretch ran for roughly 10,000 years before it finally started to ease. 10,000 years is not a lifetime. It's not even close. It's hundreds of lifetimes, stacked end to end, each one handing the same problem to the next. Nobody alive at the start of it saw the end. Nobody alive at the end remembered anything different. It was just what the world was, for that many generations in a row. And cold wasn't even the only problem. Winters ran long and dark. Plants that could be gathered for food shrank down to almost nothing for months at a stretch. Other predators were out there too, hungry for exactly the same reasons a person was, competing for the same shrinking pool of prey. So how did anyone make it through that? Not with one clever trick, with several systems stacked on top of each other, where losing any single one of them could be the difference between making it to spring or not. Start with fire, because everything else depends on it. Fire wasn't new by this point. Humans had been using it for a very long time already, but during the coldest stretches, fire stopped being a convenience and became the actual center of daily life. It cooked meat that would otherwise be too tough or too frozen to eat. It rendered fat down into something your body could actually use for quick energy, which mattered enormously when calories were the difference between working muscle and a body starting to shut down. It kept the worst of the cold off skin through the night. It kept predators at a distance because very few animals want to walk toward flame. People didn't just build a fire and hope. They tended it. They carried embers with them when they moved camp, wrapped and protected, so they wouldn't have to start completely from nothing in a new location. They stored dry fuel inside shelters specifically, so a sudden storm couldn't leave them without heat exactly when they needed it most. Losing your fire wasn't an inconvenience. In the coldest months, it could be fatal within a single night. And fire wasn't only about staying alive in the narrow physical sense. Sit around one long enough and it becomes the place where the day actually happens, where food gets cooked and shared, where tools get repaired, where a kid learns how something is made by watching it get made, over and over until they can do it themselves. Take the fire away and you don't just lose warmth, you lose the one place everyone naturally gathers. Next, clothing. And this is where it gets more impressive than most people expect. This wasn't animal skin thrown over shoulders like a blanket. Ice Age humans were tailoring. Small, precise needles carved from bone, with an actual eye at one end for thread, show up again and again at cold weather sites from this period. That single detail matters more than it sounds like it should. A needle with an eye means someone wasn't just wrapping hide around a body. They were cutting pieces to a shape, stitching seams tight enough to hold heat in, layering one garment over another. Multiple layers, built from different animals depending on what each layer needed to do. A closer-fitting inner layer from a softer hide, an outer layer from something tougher and more weather-resistant, sometimes built specifically to shed water and wind. Fur-trimmed hoods, fitted leggings instead of a loose wrap. Some evidence even points to footwear built in layers, the Ice Age version of a boot. Hands and feet needed their own answer too, since those are the first places a body loses heat, and the first places frostbite actually takes hold. Mittens instead of bare fingers. Wrapped, layered footwear instead of skin pressed straight against frozen ground. Small details, easy to overlook, and exactly the kind of detail that separates a person who makes it through the season from one who doesn't. This is tailoring, actual garment construction, with actual planning behind it, built by people who understood exactly what kind of cold they were up against and engineered a specific answer to it. And every one of those needles represents hours somebody chose to spend on something that wasn't hunting, wasn't fire tending, wasn't gathering, sitting still, working thread through hide by feel and firelight. Because a torn seam in the coldest week of the year wasn't a small problem. It was the kind of problem that could end a person's winter. Now shelter, because you can't carry fire and clothing your whole life without somewhere to actually stop. In some places, the answer was already sitting there. Natural rock shelters, cut into hillsides or riverbanks by nothing but time, gave people a roof and 3 walls for free. Move in, add a fire near the opening, and you've got real protection from wind without building anything. But in the open, treeless stretches, where wood for a real structure barely existed, people built something that sounds almost unbelievable until you see it. Circular dwellings made from dozens of enormous animal bones, skulls, ribs, tusks, stacked and arranged into a solid frame, then covered over with hide for insulation. Building with the largest bones available, because there was nothing else large enough to build with. Some of these structures were roughly the size of a small room, and in at least one case, evidence suggests a single structure like this was used on and off for centuries. Not one desperate winter. Generations coming back to the same footprint of ground. That's not a shelter thrown together in a panic. That's a piece of architecture, passed down. Next, food. Because none of the rest matters if you can't actually keep eating. Huge animals moved across these frozen landscapes. Massive, hairy, well-insulated herds built for exactly this kind of cold. To Ice Age humans, they were both the biggest threat on the horizon and the single largest source of calories available. Taking one down was not a safe afternoon. These were animals that could weigh many times more than a person, built with tusks and horns and raw size as their own defense. A hunt like that meant real risk, coordinated by a group, often ending badly for someone even when it worked. But a single successful hunt could feed a group for weeks, which is exactly why people kept taking that risk instead of walking away from it. But hunting alone wasn't the whole strategy. Meat spoils. Winters are long, so people got deliberate about it. Fat and marrow, wrapped and stored for later instead of eaten immediately. Meat dried and preserved specifically to get through stretches when fresh food simply wasn't out there to find. Rivers and coastlines added another option where they were available. Fish and shellfish filling gaps a hunt alone couldn't cover. Nobody relied on just one food source if they could help it. Too much could go wrong with any single one of them. That's planning across weeks and months, not just the next meal. That's understanding a season is coming before it arrives, and doing something about it now instead of later. One more piece, and it's easy to miss because it doesn't leave behind a physical object the way a needle or a fire pit does. People. Hunting something the size of a small building isn't a one-person job. Neither is keeping a fire fed through the night, sewing enough clothing for a whole family, or building a shelter out of bones heavy enough to need several sets of hands just to lift. Ice Age groups stayed small, usually a few dozen people, but they split the work. Some people got better at tracking, some got better at working hide. Someone always knew where the herds moved this time of year, because they'd watched it happen before, or because someone older had told them. None of that gets written down. It gets said out loud, around the fire, over and over, until a kid who heard it enough times becomes the person who says it to the next kid. Lose the people who know it, and you don't just lose a person. You lose the only copy of everything they knew. Put all 5 of those together. Fire, clothing, shelter, food storage, people, and what they carried in their heads. None of them optional, none of them a nice to have. Lose your fire, and the cold gets you before morning. Lose your clothing seams to wear and tear with no way to repair them, and exposure catches up fast. Lose your shelter, and there's nowhere to do any of the rest. Run out of stored food before the thaw, and none of the other 3 matter anymore. Lose the people who actually know how to do all of it, and the next hard winter has no one left who remembers the answer. Survival wasn't a single invention. It was 5 separate systems, each one demanding real skill, each one failing without constant maintenance, all of them running at the same time, every single day, for generation after generation. People did this without knowing when it would end, without a calendar counting down to spring, without any guarantee the ice would ever pull back at all, just doing the next necessary thing, day after day, because the alternative wasn't an option. Open your freezer again sometime. 10 seconds and you already want out. Somebody's ancestors lived their whole lives in that cold, raised kids in it, buried people in it, taught the next generation how to keep doing all 5 of those things, so that generation could teach the one after that, hundreds of times over, long before anyone had a word for what an ice age even was. More of these are coming, on the small human questions history books usually skip. Subscribe so the next one finds you.